Getting ready for a PCC performance evaluation can be very stressful. My team and I have been guiding professional coaches since 2012 to achieve their ACC, PCC, and MCC. And when you record a coaching session to submit either directly to the ICF for evaluation or to your training provider, because that is packaged inside of a level 2 program, you're going to probably be wondering, how will I make sure that this recording has everything I need in order to achieve my PCC? So those of us that have been trained to actually assess at a PCC level, which we're focusing on in this tutorial, we are trained to look for evidence and contra-evidence. So when a performance evaluation fails, and I'm using the word fail in inverted commas, is not got sufficient evidence to award a PCC credential, the question is why? And how can you avoid that? So this is like lifting the curtain on what myself and my team and other assessors are really listening for when we are listening to your PCC session. So you can also think of this as a guide, a step-by-step guide to passing your ICF PCC performance evaluation. I'm an MCC and I'm listed with the ICF as a Director of Education, and I've been leading a team of instructors, mentors, and supervisors and assessors since 2012, and we've been helping coaches and leaders and therapists since then to reach ACC, PCC, and MCC. So what you're getting in this tutorial is, after assessing these recordings over all these years, we have seen the same mistakes. So I'm going to first show you basic skill contra-evidence pieces, and I'll be giving you an actual example for each as well as the fix for each. And then we're going to move on to structural problems, what I call structural problems with assessments, with performance evaluations that you can also use to check. Now keep in mind, my intention here is as an educator. And as ICF PCC markers, for example, we are told very, very clearly, and I want you to hear this, this is no reflection on you as a person or you as a coach. We are not judging a coach. We are not even judging your coaching per se. We are listening to a recording of you coaching and assessing that coaching on its own merits. And what we're listening for is evidence that you achieve the ICF competencies, and we're listening for contra-evidence that indicates you are missing the mark, you are not delivering on a competency, or you are in breach of some kind of ICF code of ethics. We are also listening for, is there sufficient evidence? In other words, have you given us enough to go, yes, this coach is demonstrating this particular competency? And when we mark an assessment, we are literally time stamping the evidence. So you might demonstrate a particular competency several times during a session, and each time will count as evidence to strengthen our confidence in being able to say there was sufficient evidence to award this person a PCC. So what this video is not about are all the little technical details about how to record the session, what format your file needs to be in, how long it needs to be, etc. Please do refer to the ICF directly for their rules about the transcripts that you will need, the language, the time stamps, etc., etc. So the language of skills and structure is not ICF language. It's the way I prefer to teach. So I'm also making an assumption that you have received or are in the process of receiving a proper level 2 ICF accredited coach training education. Say that 3 times fast. So that this kind of tutorial is supplementary. It is not meant to replace real training with mentoring and feedback. And yes, sure, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. If you're looking for that kind of training, of course, innerlifeskills.com would be happy to assist. So the skills contra evidence, the quote-unquote mistakes, could be divided up into 3 categories, where we have issues with partnership with our clients, where we are failing to notice opportunities to coach in a session, or when we are not responding to those opportunities appropriately. So when we are listening to your coaching performance evaluation, I, not the ICF, have put these 3 buckets here for you, or these 3 umbrella concepts to help you to understand some of the bigger themes. So partnership is a big ICF theme. Listening for and being able to have the skill to spot opportunities inside of your coaching session, as well as the way you respond. And I'm calling these skills because this should show up throughout your performance evaluation recording. This is not the kind of thing that you only see in the beginning or only see near the end of a session. This is everywhere. This needs to show up. Then we're going to move on to structural issues and concerns. And I'm dividing the session into 3 parts, which we actually do when we train professional coaches. The start of a session, the main body, the bulk of your coaching session, and of course the way you wrap up, the way you close off your session. And I'm going to give you the most common mistakes that we hear, or the contra evidence pieces that we hear at the start, during the bulk of the session, the main part of the session, as well as the most common errors that we see near the end. Throughout your performance evaluation, the recording of you coaching, you need to be demonstrating that you are in partnership with your client. Now, there are many layers to what partnership means, but one of the biggest criteria, because it shows up in the ICF core competencies as well as in their code of ethics, is leading the client, giving advice, or stepping into a role that isn't coaching. So for example, if the client says, I want to stop procrastinating. For the last year, I'm very grateful that most of our ICF accredited classes and programs have sold out, sometimes up to 6 months in advance of their start date. Making this content to support our global community and to support you is our way of giving back. It's an act of gratitude because we believe in giving to grow and growing to give, like everything in nature does. So we'd really appreciate that subscribe if this work serves you and if this content resonates with you. Thank you. Even if we disguise our advice as a question, like, have you thought of this method, or have you read this good book on how to stop procrastinating, or this is how I have found is a useful way to stop procrastinating. Would you be interested in chatting about that? The thing is, and this is a shock to a lot of folks who don't realize what pure professional coaching is that we don't give advice. A coach is able to transform, to hold a space, to work with a client in such a way that they achieve real value, change, transformation, that they move forward in their life, but without giving advice. And that's why the word partnership is so key. And I'm sure you have heard that in the journey of your coaching education. So a contra evidence would be anything that sounded like the coach starting to give advice. Now, if this was slight and the rest of the session was really strong and there was enough evidence to balance it off, you may still have your performance evaluation make it through. But if this is really heavy, in other words, there's a lot of contra evidence that you are not in partnership, that you are making decisions for your clients, that you are choosing and deciding and leading and advising, and that you are definitely not staying in the true role of coach, you will probably find that your performance evaluation example, the recording that you give, won't be admissible or it won't make the grade. So what do we do instead? Well, of course, we coach. And there's a lot to coaching, of course. But for example, and just to make the point, if somebody said, I want to stop procrastinating, you've started the session and this is a skill, so it's throughout. They've just said something that they've wanted. Something that they're wanting to overcome, something that they want to achieve. I call it inner obstacles. One of the responses that would be a more appropriate coaching response is, for example, to say, I'm curious, why is it important to you to stop procrastinating? So when we start exploring why something's valuable to someone, when we start unpacking their perspectives, their values, their strengths, when we start looking for their solutions, their insights, their intuitions, we have started coaching. So in the partnership of coaching, we aren't solving the problem. We aren't fixing it. And this should be good news if you're still new to coaching, because you realize we don't carry people as coaches. We hold a space that empowers people to help themselves, to find the resources and the strengths and the insights within them and to draw that out. And this brings us to the next linked problem that we hear in the same category of partnership. And that is that you really do need to demonstrate that you understand the role of coaching and how it's different to therapy, for example, or to management, or to just showing up as a friend. So here's an example. The client says, I feel like I've been procrastinating since childhood. Now, what's wrong? I'm asking you to spot this. What could be, and obviously I'm using the word wrong. What is the contra evidence here if the coach replies, tell me about your childhood? Now, again, if there's one or two of these, is probably not going to be too much of a problem. But if you're aiming for mastery, if you really want to demonstrate pure coaching and achieve your PCC, it is better to understand that as coaches, we don't, what I call at Inner Life Skills, we don't spiral down. So spiraling down means we don't intentionally open dialogue about the past, especially in terms of pain, problem, story. We're not doing that. We're not opening the wound. We're not equipped, and it is not our scope as coaches to do that. So instead, we would do the following. If the client started leading into a conversation about the past, that they've been procrastinating since childhood, a coach might start to reframe, gently redirect, what do you want for your future? Now, what I'm not saying is that if the client starts sharing some of their story or some of their vulnerability, that we shut them down. Of course, we don't do that. It's really important to show up like a human being that cares and a professional, that if somebody is being vulnerable, we hold space. And if they really feel the need to share some of their story, we listen. But we don't intentionally go there. Can you see the difference? The third mistake or piece of contra evidence is even bigger than just a note that a PCC marker would make on your performance evaluation. And that is a breach of ethic. The ICF's Code of Ethics is essential reading. They update it regularly. Make sure that you've gone through it and that you understand the essence. Also note that in the ICF core competencies, in particular the first competency, you will see a mention of ethic. By the way, I have a number of great video tutorials covering each of the ICF core competencies that is probably worth a look at. The point I want to make is that ethics is linked to partnership, and to our role, because as coaches, we need to be aware of the ICF core competencies as well as their ethics. A breach of ethic is such a big red flag for us as PCC markers when we are marking a performance evaluation, that we can even disqualify a performance evaluation. In other words, it's not just a note that this is a piece of contra evidence. If there is enough of a failure to achieve competencies, sure, but if there's a breach in ethic, we can throw out the whole recording. So this is really important, but what I wanted to show you with this example is how subtle this can actually be. Let's say the client says, I don't know how to stop procrastinating, that same example, and the coach thinks it's really helpful to give the client a method how their boss stopped procrastinating. Here's how your boss stopped procrastinating. So, of course, there's a number of problems with this. Can you spot the problems? First of all, it is advice. So that would be contra evidence. But the moment we start sharing information about other people and their coaching, even not specific information, we are in breach of confidentiality. And confidentiality is a big part of the ICF Code of Ethics, and therefore this would be a big problem for a performance evaluation. So do make sure that there's no conflict of interest showing up. Understand your role as a coach, be committed to your own ongoing developments, etc., and watch out for even subtle hints that could be interpreted as a breach of confidentiality. So how do we partner with our clients in a way that is ethical and actually gives contra evidence that supports the strength of a PCC performance evaluation? Well, we follow coaching principles. So for example, if the client said, I don't know how to stop procrastinating, I mean, there are dozens and dozens of departure points from there, but one could be, so if you found how to stop procrastinating today, would that make this session worthwhile? Which I know is a closed question, and you're going to see that I talk about closed questions later as a potential problem, sometimes as contra evidence, but there is an appropriate use of them. And it is especially when we are confirming an outcome for the session outcome, or what in Inner Life Skills we call the contract, which is coaching jargon for what does the client want to achieve in the session? What do they agree to, and what do they choose themselves? So to stay in the boundaries of partnership and to honor the ethics of what it means to partner with our clients, when a client mentions something, we can reframe and we can also start leaning into what do they want from the session. The next category of things to watch out for is in the broad bucket umbrella of opportunities. Are you spotting opportunities to coach, or are you dismissing those opportunities? So I like to play with words, and when we dismiss, or minimize, those are problems. Those are potential contra evidence. So here's an example. The client says, I hate procrastinating all the time. And listen to the coach response. Oh, procrastination's not so bad. Can you see how this is a problem and why this is a problem? First of all, there was an opportunity to coach. I mean, the client has actually put something vulnerable on the table. They've shared something that's quite personal, that belongs to what they want out of the coaching session. And the coach dismissed it. And what's worse is they minimized it. They made something that was important to the client smaller. And they did this with a comment. So comments in general are dangerous territory, and I would really recommend that you avoid making comments wherever possible in your coaching session. Keep it nice and clean, but certainly don't dismiss don't minimize. Not only would this count as contra evidence, it also could start to step into the territory of a breach of ethic. So what could you do instead? Now, as coaches, we don't, what I call, spiral down into the story. We're not stepping out of coaching into the role of therapist. So we might not start digging into this whole theme of procrastination in terms of the past or the pain. But at the same time, we do show up with care, and we want to create emotional safety for our client. So if they've said, I hate procrastinating all the time, some kind of response to that could be appropriate, even if it's just, I'm sorry, that really does sound challenging. Where we are acknowledging that we've heard, we're not commenting, we're not minimizing, we're not cheerleading, and neither are we trying to fix. Going to a restaurant. If you went to a restaurant, the waiter would say, what would you like today? If you tell the waiter what you don't want, they don't have an order yet. And the waiter might reframe you. You said, I don't want vegetables. The waiter might say, well, what do you want instead of vegetables? And as coaches, sometimes it's a similar type of thing, especially in the early part of a session when we're trying to find out what a client wants. They often will tell us what they don't want. They'll tell us they don't want to be stressed. They don't want to have this experience in their life. They don't want a particular emotion. Reframing is gently moving someone's attention from what they don't want to find out what they do want, but without dismissing, minimizing, without making comments, while we still allow somebody to be vulnerable and hold a safe space for them. Can you see the difference? If your client has given you an opportunity to coach and you miss it entirely, that can also count as contra evidence. So here's an example, again on the topic of procrastination. A client says, I guess I could try stop procrastinating by talking to myself in a positive way. But the coach replies, when would you like to start that? Or they ask a question that misses the opportunity that was presented. This can often happen when coaches rely on scripts, which of course you should not do for your performance evaluation. And even worse, please don't rehearse and script and act out a performance evaluation. We can hear it, and it's also a serious violation of ICF Code of Ethics. So instead, what we want to do is we want to respond to the opportunity. We want to be able to spot the opportunity. Imagine sitting with a loved one at the end of a really busy day, and something significant has happened in the day. So you're having dinner and you share. You tell the person that you're with, gee, this significant thing happened. Imagine if they replied, please pass the salt. How would that feel? When we're coaching, if we're trying to perform, if we're focused on the structure and a script and trying to tick off all the boxes, what happens is we stop listening, and then we miss opportunities to coach. And we skip over important things. And when a client has said something to us, they've hesitated, they've put a solution on the table, they've brought an insight to bear, they've shared a vulnerability, and we skip in a way that is super obvious that we're just asking another question. We aren't responding to that opportunity. That counts as contra evidence. So what could we do instead? Well, there are many possible approaches, but anything that meets the client where they're at and makes use of the opportunity. And obviously the context of the coaching, what the client has shared so far, their long-term goals, what they want from the session, these are all going to come into play. But for example, let's say that the client said, well, I guess I could try stop procrastinating by talking to myself in a positive way, which means that they've come up with a little bit of a solution. There's some hesitancy there. And by the way, that is also an opportunity that we could take. We could lean into, may I just check something? There sounded like some hesitancy. There sounded like a tone of voice change. Am I right? Am I hearing that correctly? Would you like to comment on that? That's an opportunity. It's a more subtle opportunity. It's a more PCC, MCC response, but it's still an opportunity. The low-hanging fruit here is actually the solution. The client has put on the table that they think they might like to start talking to themselves in a positive way. Now, when a client puts something like that on the table, we don't want to be the person that says, can you please pass the salt? So one example, and this is probably more of an ACC, early PCC style of reply, which is perfectly fine, is a solution-focused question. What could talking to yourself in a positive way possibly look like? Now, I have added a bit of what I call softening here, so that the question has more of an invitational tone, that it isn't harsh and direct, because when we ask questions in a very harsh or direct way, people tend to shut down. But this is a response to the opportunity, and that would count as evidence, and it may actually support even more than one core competency. In the same space of making sure that you are responding to opportunities and spotting those opportunities, we also want to be noticing when our clients put solutions onto the table. And what we don't want to do is, once again, to move mechanically on to the next part of what we think needs to happen in a coaching session, instead of spotting the client just put something on the table. So can you imagine if the client says, I think procrastinating might be my way of checking if I'm on the right path. So that's an insight. That's something important that the client has discovered. They've got a new insight, a new, what ICF used to call new awareness. And part of what we look for as assessors, especially when I show you the structural problems that can show up, is we look for whether you are meeting the ICF core competencies, especially 7 and 8, where some of the criteria are that is the client leaving the session with more than they arrived. Now, that can only happen if we are responding to the opportunities that the client is putting on the table. So can you imagine if the client's just said that, and then the coach responds with a great question, but a question that doesn't meet that opportunity? What resources could you possibly use to beat procrastination? It sounds like a stock standard mechanical question. It does not respond to the specific opportunity that has showed up. So have a look at this possible response as a fix for this particular issue. The client has spotted their solution. They've said something. We don't always have to respond with a question. We can, and we can weave the client's words into our response. But something that I absolutely love teaching, such a simple technique, is called backtracking. And backtracking, what you're doing is you are noticing the words the client is using, and you are weaving them into the next question or comment. And the simplest form of backtracking is simply to say some of the words again. And I know it'll feel a bit strange at first, but it actually works really, really well as a form of active and reflective listening that is clean and simple and elegant. So the client has said, I think procrastinating might be my way of checking if I'm on the right path. And we just simply say, checking if you're on the right path. It's a type of statement. It's a little bit of a question. And then the person will think about it and go, yeah, or they'll go, no, and they'll correct their thinking. So sometimes literally mirroring an aspect of what somebody has said is sufficient. And certainly, even if we turned what the client said into a question, if we ask them about what the right path might look like, if we ask them how this insight is landing for them, we could ask them what else is showing up with this particular insight or solution. So there's dozens of different ways we could respond to this opportunity. The one I gave you as an example here is just a simple, clean, elegant backtracking. And now we look at how will you respond. And when we are analyzing your performance evaluation, looking for evidence, looking for contra evidence, there are certain kinds of responses that tend to start stacking up as contra evidence. You might at first glance think, what's wrong with this question, Cole? Can you imagine being free of procrastination? That sounds like a lovely coaching response, and it's not entirely wrong, but it's a closed question. And I'm using this very specifically because closed questions have a ripple effect in a coaching session beyond that one moment of contra evidence. An occasional closed question is really not a problem, and there are specific reasons to use closed questions as a coach, especially if we are checking the progress of the session, where we're checking in with the client that are they getting what they wanted? Is this what they want from the session? Yes or no? We're clarifying, we're checking. Now, your client might hear a question like this and understand that what is being asked for is them to unpack something. But the thing is, our subconscious mind is going to hear that it's a yes or no answer that's being asked for. And closed questions have an edge to them. So wherever possible, turn your closed questions into open ones. So instead of can you imagine being free of procrastination, the technical answer is yes or no. What we're really wanting is for the client to be invited to imagine. So look at this response instead as a possible improved response. If you were free of procrastinating, what could that possibly look like? And the introduction of the word possibly softens the edge of that question even more, inviting someone to brainstorm, inviting your client to throw spaghetti at the wall instead of what will it look like, and forcing some kind of definite answer. The more space we can give our clients, the better. When editing this tutorial, I noticed I left one of the mistakes out. So inserting it right now. If you've done even the smallest amount of training in the professional coaching space, you would have come across the importance of active listening or reflective listening, or both. Listening is an absolutely critical part of what we do as coaches. So your performance evaluation has to show that you are listening and that you are listening well, that you're not asking a question that your client has already answered, for example, that you are responding to what you are hearing and in an appropriate way. Some of the problems that we hear is that when this becomes mechanical, or when the listening isn't good, so you're not listening thoroughly, that shows up and potentially can become contra-evidence. Imagine the client says, I want to stop procrastinating. And the coach wants to reflect that back. So they want to respond with active listening, which means that they're proving that they've heard, there's some kind of acknowledgement, and they want to reflect back what they've heard. Now, one of the things that I recommend you don't ever do is you never make assumptions about what the client means, and you don't take those assumptions and put them into your own words. So that's a very important tip. It exposes you to a break in rapport and trust. So the example I always use is, imagine I'm being coached and I tell my coach I want to tackle a very big inbox because my email lists or my emails are always huge and my inbox is always huge and there's a lot to do. And imagine the coach decides to reflect that back to me, but in their own words. And they say, it sounds like you're not coping. It sounds like you're stressed. It sounds like you feel overwhelmed. All of those are assumptions. They're actually judgments, and they can get us into hot water very quickly. So instead, we stick to our client's words. So in this example, we have done that. The coach has actually used the word stop procrastinating because those are the words that the client has used. So that's excellent. We call that backtracking, where we weave in the client's words into the next conversation point, comment, question. So that's very good. We don't want to overdo that either. It can start to sound strange. But the problem that I want to point out here, which is not an ICF listed marker or anything, it's just something that in my experience I've seen causes problems. When we preamble, so if I hear you correctly, so if I understand you correctly, so if what you're saying is, imagine that you're talking to someone and they keep saying that. So if I hear you correctly, and then they repeat all or some of what you've said. And there are variations of this, of course, but you get the idea. How would that feel? What starts to happen is we start to think, hey, why do you keep saying that? It's mechanical and it's really not necessary. You can actually just remove it entirely. It's going to create more space. You're still honoring what you've heard, and you're reflecting it back. Another quick point is what backtracking is and what active listening is in this clean, simple, elegant way is it's not summarizing endlessly. Okay? So we're not summarizing. So when the client has given us a whole bunch of story, or they've explained, or they've unpacked, or they've shared, we're not taking everything they've said and summarizing it back. We're not repeating entire sentences. If you want to summarize, it's actually better to ask your client, would you like me to summarize that? And then they can say yes or no. So this is much simpler. So I'm exaggerating slightly the potentially better response. And of course, there are lots of different ways to prove we're listening and to actually listen. But I wanted to show you the elegance of not always paraphrasing, not always asking a question where the client has said, I want to stop procrastinating. And we just say, to stop procrastinating. And it'll sound a bit strange at first, but this kind of simple, we've heard, we drop the words back into the space. One of my favorite things to do with that is also to sometimes, only occasionally, say to a client, when I say your words back to you, you want to stop procrastinating. How does that land for you? Or what happens for you when you hear your own words back, or any variation of that? That's quite a nice response, but it's a response that you only want to use occasionally. Don't make any of these mechanical. This is such a simple mistake. It's a big mistake that because a lot of people do this. And it's also big because removing this has a very positive impact on our coaching. I'm calling them silence fillers. Now, many of the ICF competencies list this as a PCC marker, it's not a make or break marker. It's not a make or break piece of contra evidence, but you will see it has a massive effect on many of the competencies. So that's why removing this and improving this can be so significant. And the great news is it's really simple. This is not a difficult thing to understand, but it is a habit, and a lot of our habits are a little bit like pulling weeds out the garden, not always easy to do at first. So imagine the client says, if I was free of procrastination, I think I'd be more confident. Now we hear this and we want to respond in a way that is warm and supportive. And so what we tend to do is a couple of things. We tend to say words like great and wonderful, and there's nothing particularly wrong with that occasionally. But as you head towards high levels of PCC, early MCC territory, I would highly recommend that you even remove those. And you might say, but Cole, then doesn't the coaching become very sterile and very cold? Not if you are doing everything else with warmth and with care. And you could even say, I'm really interested in, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on. And you can show warmth and you can show engagement. The problem with these words is that they're often just fillers. And what you'll hear, and what my team and I have heard many times, is that if you tend to do this, you tend to do this all the time. Every time the client says something, we go, okay, great, wonderful, yeah, wonderful. Because we think we're supposed to show someone that we're listening. We think this is a form of acknowledgement. So you've got two basic kinds of fillers here. There's the affirming, positive validation, positive judgments, and then you've got the the sound effects. Yes, the sound effects. Both can be problematic, and both remove the spaciousness that we want to create for our clients. You know, one of the ways that I can tell very quickly when listening to a coached recording session that the coach is really matured, that they've got a lot of experience, that they are heading into even MCC territory, is the amount of space and the amount of silence and the amount of softening in a session. We clutter the space when we do too much of the It's subtle, but it makes a big difference. We clutter the silence and the space when we stack questions, when we ask 2-3 questions in a row, when we try to help someone with their thinking by commenting, by the cleanest, simplest coaching, where you ask a relevant, spontaneous question that meets the client where they are, using your competencies, using your skills, and then you be quiet. You hold engaged space. You don't fill the silence. And then softening is taking the edge off the questions, bringing some warmth into your tone rather than pom-pom cheerleading, wonderful, great. And I know coach students and graduates of my programs have said to me often, but Cole, it's natural to say wonderful and to be complimentary. And I argue with them, and I'd love you to hear me out on this. Certain kinds of clients will feel absolutely patronized by great, wonderful. Other clients may feel neutral, and other clients may feel that they are getting a pat on the back from you. And if they are even slightly insecure or feeling a bit low, they might start catering their answers to get more of that positive reinforcement. And my last argument is that if somebody gives you, for example, a solution, they come up with an idea, they say, I know what I want to do. I want to pursue this particular goal. Halfway through the session, they change their mind. But you've already said wonderful Great. You've already affirmed they can't change their mind easily now without risking that social etiquette thing that you've given them approval. And our job as coaches is to stay neutral, in that neutral, truly neutral state of partnership, instead of being thumbs up, thumbs down. We want to be equal. We want to be neutral. So wherever possible, removing the greats, the wonderfuls, as well as the aha and the is going to not just give you more strength to your whole session, it's going to lean into many of your competencies. And certainly it will reduce the amount of contra evidence in your performance evaluation. So as an example, instead of great, wonderful, okay, imagine the client said, if I was free of procrastination, I think I'd be more confident. And hear this response. I'd love to know, why is being confident important to you? So there's two parts to that. I'd love to know brings some warmth, but now any of these things you can't use more than once, okay? Or twice maybe, because when they become habitual, when we start using them mechanically, they lose their authenticity. And then the second part is the why question. And there are so many variations of this, but it's the inquiry into the meaning of something for someone. And it's also backtracking the word confident, so that we want to unpack that a bit more. So we could have done a dozen different responses, but this shows the warmth we wanted to show with the great and the wonderful. It's free of ums and ahs and ums. It's just another good coaching question. Now we're going to change approach. We're going to look at structural issues. So I've divided these contra evidence mistakes into the start, the middle or the main part of the session, and the close of the session. And I'm going to give you also the most common mistakes that I've heard through all these years, and things that I think are relatively easy for you to weed out, to improve, and to strengthen your PCC performance evaluation. What you want to make sure that you've done is that you have partnered with the client to discover what they want from this session. If you give them the outcome, that is a very significant contra evidence, because without a clear outcome from your client, you are doing a lot of guesswork. You don't know what the client actually wants to achieve, actually wants to take away from the session. I call those contracts, and I know it sounds like legal jargon, and we never use that jargon with clients, but a contract is a deliverable. It's something a client can actually do, achieve, accomplish in the time frame of the session. So it's very time specific, and it is different to a long-term goal. So a client might want to write a book. That's not a contract, that's a long-term goal. The outcome of the session, the contract of the session, could be that they want confidence to start, or they want to brainstorm an action plan, or they want to overcome procrastination, or it could be hundreds of different kinds of specific outcomes that the client wants, but it is something that can be achieved. It is something that the client can actually do in the session that you as the coach can facilitate. Without a contract and without, there's a number of items that link into a contract, so we don't even do this lightly. We don't just touch on it lightly. Without that, you are risking jumping straight into solution-focused conversation. And I always say to our students and our graduates and our clients, a lot of natural coaches are natural coaches because they have this solution-focused way of thinking. They love helping people grow. So they tend to jump too quickly into, how do you fix this? What are the solutions? and they don't spend enough time contracting and setting the stage before heading into the solution-focused conversation. So here is one of many different kinds of questions you could ask to at least initiate the conversation that extracts a contract. What would you like to leave with after our coaching session? And you could even mention after our 45 minutes, after our 60-minute session, after our 3-hour group facilitated coached meeting. Mentioning the time is also really, really helpful. And asking them what they want to leave with, what they want to achieve, what would make the time valuable for them is going to initiate the conversation. If your client is used to coaching and they have been for many sessions, you will find that that part is easier because they get used to the idea. But for clients that are relatively new or that are just having a moment of I'm not sure, this whole establishing a contract can take a bit of time. And the client doesn't always hand it to you on a silver platter, which is why we need to be able to facilitate this skillfully. And when we think we have heard a contract, we want to check it. And by checking it and getting it and making sure that the client is the one that decided it, which means that we partnered with them, you would achieve several pieces of evidence across more than one competency. If, however, you do not establish a coaching session outcome, you would get contra evidence for that. If you let the client give you all the power and you picked it, or you took that power and you chose it, that would be major contra evidence. If you failed to check that that is actually what they wanted from the session, you would also get contra evidence. So this defined outcome is very, very important. What I suggest you do is you work on this contracting skill. When you hear it, you check it, you write it down, and of course that becomes the focus for the whole session. If the client seems to change their mind or starts heading down a new path in a session, you would then be checking if they want to change. It's like a change of order at a restaurant. You check. And we, of course, allow that change to happen. We partner with our clients to make sure that it happens. One other piece that can be linked to that is some kind of measure of progress. Now, you won't necessarily get contra evidence if you don't have a measure of progress, but it will count as good evidence if you do. And it will strengthen several competencies, including competency number 8, to have a measure of progress. So what is a measure of progress? Let's say that the client's answer to the question, what would you like to leave with after our coaching session, is that they want to leave confident to start. And I'm leaving the topic blank because it could be so many things. Confident to start their new exercise program, confident to start studying their MBA, confident to start looking for new work, confident to start appreciating themselves more. I mean, thousands of ideas just can flow if you let them. So it's confidence to start, and we're going to just leave that out. Whatever they said, of course, you would insert that word and you would use your client's words. A measure of progress could be something like if 10 out of 10 was confident and 0 out of 10 was not confident at all. I'm curious, how confident are you feeling to start right now? They give you a number. Let's say they say, I'm at a 4 out of 10. Then you ask, where would you like to be at the end of the session? Maybe they say, I'd like to get to an 8. That becomes a measure of progress. A wonderful thing to do with that is to check in somewhere in the middle of the session and even at the end of the session. You said at the beginning of the session you wanted to get to an 8 in terms of confidence to start. where are you now? And if they have made progress, perhaps they're now at a 7 or even an 8, you can check in what else they need. You can fulfill a number of criteria or a number of competency markers for competency 7 and 8 simply by using a measure of progress at the start of the session, checking in somewhere, and checking in at the end. It will reinforce that your client has achieved more than they arrived with. It will reinforce that you stayed focused on what your client wanted and needed, and it's going to have a knock-on effect and strengthen your session as a whole. Many years ago, the ICF used to describe one of their PCC markers as awareness above solutions. And once I understood what that meant, I really loved this description, but it confused so many people. So I was very happy to see that the language had changed over the years. Now the ICF refer to it as coaching the what and the who. So what does what mean and who is pretty obvious, right? And you're going to see I mention this 2 more times, so it's that important. When we are only coaching the what, which is practical solutions, there's nothing wrong with that, and we will absolutely achieve, as long as we've got everything else in place, ACC. But for PCC and for MCC, we need to have evidence that we can also coach the who. And the who is not a band. I'm showing my age, from the 80s. Who means the person, your client, right? Your client, their context, their identity, their intuitions, their creativity, their values, their strengths, them as a person. So the question, why is that important to you, is such a simple question. Don't overuse it. But any exploration of meaning, of value, of significance is going to lean the conversation towards the who and make sure that it's not only the what. So if your client wants to clean their garage, the what part of the coaching is the action plan, the goal, them getting boxes and timelines and accountability and all that good stuff. But it's not enough to demonstrate PCC and certainly MCC. We want to hear that you've also coached the person as a person. So that means you want to look for performance evaluation examples where there is a strong space and a strong amount of coaching the who. This is particularly helpful if you've got some examples of coaching sessions where there's some inner obstacle work, where people are working on their strengths, where they are doing some kind of self-exploration. And if you lean into that quite strongly and heavily in a session, you are going to stack up solid evidence. Now, this is true for every part of the structure of your full session. But it is true that you should also have this in the beginning of the session. So that means that when you are unpacking a conversation about the goals, the long-term goals, as well as what they want from the session, that you don't keep it only practical, that you don't just stick to this glorified to-do list making, that you do lean with invitation and with permission and with the client partnering with you, and if they're comfortable going there, into the territory of who they are as a person. And you'll see this going to show up twice more. Another really helpful structural element where a lot of subtle contra-evidence can show up and mistakes can show up is big picture, small picture. Now, again, this is my language. This is not ICF language. Okay. And this is particularly relevant in the start of your coached conversation. So I like to think of this as picture a hot air balloon. So a hot air balloon is going to take you up into the sky. It's going to take you up into, there's a cloud, right? And there's the sun, right? Very bad drawing of a hot air balloon. Okay. Here we go. That looks a bit better. Not really. Hot air balloon is aerial view. It's big picture thinking. On the ground is all the detail. On the ground is the what, when, how, specific detail. When somebody really starts to ace their PCC and MCC competencies, they naturally start a session high up, as if the aerial view is in play, as if that hot air balloon is right up there. And only throughout the session does that hot air balloon lower down, so that near the end of the session, you get into the to-do list, you get into the next steps. And what I found is that amateur coaches and coaches that don't know this tend to skip, or either skip the big picture entirely and they jump straight into the to-do list, or they bounce between the big picture and the to-do list too harshly. So to understand this, take a moment to think about this. Imagine that you have this aspiration or you have this goal and somebody's coaching you and they ask you big picture questions like the one that I've given you here. Imagine you're there. Imagine you have achieved this aspiration, this change, this goal that you have. What would that feel like? So now you take your time, you're using your imagination, and you're creating this big picture view. It can feel very aspirational. It's like that hot air balloon's lifting. But imagine that the next question I ask you is, so when can you commit to making a start to this? It's like a diary question. It's a to-do list question. If you feel into it intuitively, it can feel like that hot air balloon gets popped, dish, and lands too quickly. If you want to accumulate a significant amount of good evidence and avoid contra evidence, start your session with some beautiful big picture aspirational explorations. Unpacking the goal, finding out the deeper meaning, what I call a deepened value, where you're deepening how important something is for someone. You're discovering the impact that something has in someone's life. You're touching into their motivation, their inspiration, their vision. And then slowly, as the session progresses, as you unpack solutions, as you deliver on that outcome that they want, you naturally start lowering that hot air balloon, so that by the end of the session, that's when you're looking at the to-do list of what action steps are they going to take, how are they going to implement. And you'll see that it balances the whole session really beautifully. And it's something that's going to, if you don't do this, it's going to push you more firmly into probably ACC territory and not support your PCC goals. Once you are past the point of establishing an outcome for the session, one of the key things to do is to find out what your client needs to resolve in order to achieve that. A simple way of asking a question that could lead to that kind of conversation is, what could get in the way of you achieving that? So let's go back to the client wants confidence to start something. If we don't unpack what could be in the way of them achieving that confidence in the session, we might not know what obstacles we need to work with. So coaching is not just about solutions. It absolutely makes space for obstacles. What we don't do is we don't approach those obstacles with a therapy style of modality. So we're not digging intentionally into the pain, into the story, or into the past. But we absolutely are making space for obstacle conversations, for both practical contingency planning as well as what I call inner obstacles. If you don't check in with what the client will need to resolve, what the client will need to address in order to achieve their outcome during the session, it will count as a small mark of contra evidence, but it also leaves a big empty space for the main part of your coaching session where you could be working on those inner obstacles. And by working on inner obstacles, you will achieve a lot of competencies and you will accumulate a lot of evidence. You will also be showing that you can coach the who and the what, and not just the what. Sounds funny, doesn't it? The majority of your coaching session needs to be the voice of your client. It's an actual PCC marker for us to listen to that. And if you don't, if you do more talking than the client, it not only will count as contra evidence and it will be mentioned, you will see that it has a knock-on effect because there will probably also be insufficient evidence of many of the other markers and the proof of various competencies. This tends to happen when coaches only focus on the what, when they do what I call to-do list coaching. And there's nothing wrong with to-do list coaching, but these days you can get apps that can coach to-do lists, goal setting, projects. A lot of chat, GPT, AI style bots can actually facilitate pretty decent to-do list coaching conversations. It's the coaching of the who that is the human touch. And it's going to take you straight into the PCC, MCC territory. So you want to feel super confident and capable and flexible. Now, in order to do that, I believe learning various frameworks can be very, very helpful. If you have, for example, a lack of recipes, but you're trying to learn to be a chef, it's very difficult to invent different meals. It's very difficult to be creative. Now you might say, but Cole, you said don't use scripts, don't use structures. And it's true, the ICF don't want to see the frameworks. They don't want to hear the mechanics of the recipe. They want you to be spontaneously coaching the client and meeting your client where they're at. But that does not mean the recipes or the frameworks can't help you get to that point. What I've seen is that when coaches learn 20, 50 or more, and we teach over 100, and I know that sounds a lot. Some of them are very simple, some of them are much more complex. But once you've learned over 100 recipes, or at least you know you've got them in a file, maybe you've learned 10 or 20 that you're confident in, but you've got the rest. What happens is that your vocabulary as a coach has now improved. And as long as you can adapt these and be flexible with them, they've also given you a huge internal database of questions that you can ask, approaches you can take, so that when you're in this main part of delivering a session, you're not stuck. You're not staring at your client going, I can only ask a solution-focused question. I can't actually intentionally take them into various thought experiments or down various pathways. By having a database inside of you and some experience with good, solid frameworks that you can adapt, you'll be able to achieve the who and the what. You'll be able to go down different, unique ways of approaching this. Also, what's going to happen is that your clients won't keep hearing the same questions being asked every time they're with you. So you'll be able to keep it fresh and unique for yourself and your own interest as a coach as well as your clients. So for example, the question, what strengths can you use to achieve this? A discussion around strengths could be one framework, but you can't keep doing that every single time as a way to deliver on insights and resources to achieve the contract or the outcome. You need to have like a lot of flexibility here. In the heart of your coaching session, what a lot of coaches do, I think, is a mistake, is they're so afraid of not achieving the outcome for the session, which I call a contract. They're so focused on it, as well as being perhaps a little bit too rigidly attached to frameworks or scripts that are helping them to learn to be coaches, that they don't realize they can take what I call picnic routes or scenic roads to deviate off the main path. So let's say that the client wants to leave the session, as I said, with confidence to start something. Now that's the focus, that's the outcome. I'm going to put a little flag there to represent, let's just try and make that look more like a flag. Right, that's a flag. So we're aiming for that, which is fantastic. And yes, we need to change it if the client seems to want to change it. But that is the thing we've got a measure of progress for. But what happens is, in the natural coached conversation, new ideas come up, new solutions, new obstacles show up, and they feel like side roads. And sometimes a side road is going to yield a very significant insight for a client. What I want you to know about this point that I'm making is that it will hold you back from achieving PCC to not confidently take these little side roads. All you have to do is partner with your clients if you're not sure. So partnering just means checking with your client if they would like to go explore that. Would you like to unpack that more? Would you like to explore that? Shall we look at that for a moment? And if they say yes, you've got permission, off you go, the invitation is there. If they've dropped a beautiful, seemingly important, significant insight onto the table, you can also just take out a picnic basket right there, as in, don't skip over it quickly. We want to be aware of the express road to the outcome for sure. We don't want to lose track of that thing that they want. But at the same time, we want to stay with that moment for a little bit longer. And the simplest way we could do that is just, I'd love to hear more about, and maybe we don't say the word idea, maybe we say the thing that the client's just said. Perhaps let's say they've said, I'm realizing now that my confidence is linked to my ability to say no. That's a new insight on the table. Should we just ignore that, skip it, and carry on with the confidence? I don't think so. That deserves a picnic basket. And if you're not sure, partner with the client to check. But unpacking that solution, spending a bit more time with that particular insight is going to serve your client, it's going to serve you, it's going to accumulate a number of evidence pieces, not contra evidence. It's going to avoid some contra evidence because you are coaching the who and the what, and you are leaning into your client's ideas, etc. And then once you've unpacked that and it seems complete, you can move back to the confidence to start conversation. Now you're heading into the close of the session, which is the last 5 minutes, maybe a bit more. When we're marking assessments, we are listening for a number of markers, and contra evidence is quite easy to accumulate here if you rush the end of your session or if you don't mindfully finish your session strong. So the close of the session needs to be a combination of their next steps, how they're going to implement, what they're going to do with the insights that they've come up with in the session, but it also needs to acknowledge what they've done today in the session. So it's both. And if you fail to acknowledge celebrate, validate what the client has actually achieved, you will get contra evidence against that. If you also don't partner with them to look forward, what are they going to do to implement, to stay on track, to be accountable, you will also accumulate some contra evidence there. A lovely way to get what I think is quite an easy piece of evidence is to even partner with the client to find out how they would like to finish the session. And that could sound like, we have 5 minutes left. What would you like to do in these last few minutes? Or how would you like us to wrap this up? Partnering with your client to actually finish the session is going to be an easy win for you and strengthen the whole finish of the session and give you evidence for definitely ICF competency number 8 and parts of 7 as well. And there's our friend what and who again, because guess what? Your close of session should not only be about what, it should also include some who. So we don't just want to go completely to-do list on our clients. Yes. We want to include some of the who that we found in the session, and we want to strengthen that in the wrap-up of the session. So that means that we are thinking about them as a whole person, their intuitions, their identity, their strengths. So let's say in the session we had a strengths conversation, it showed up. Now we could be asking them how they can use their strengths to implement what they've discovered, as well as the what. What are they going to do? When are they going to do it? Some timelines around their next steps and their actions. So do remember to go beyond to-do lists, even in the close of the session. And your final contra evidence or mistake to be mindful of, to really help you finish your PCC performance evaluation recording and to check that you've got everything in place, is celebrate and challenge. As coaches, our job is not only to hold emotionally safe spaces and to evoke honoring somebody's context and coaching with beautiful solution-focused conversations. Our job is also to challenge. But we challenge in a way that is honoring and that serves the client. One of the best ways to challenge a client is to ask permission to do so. Yes? May I check something? May I question that? May I challenge that? It's a way of giving feedback because, yes, as coaches, we can give feedback. So this is not only in the close of the session, this could be in the middle of the session, at the beginning of the session. I would suggest that you wait until you've established a fair bit of connection and trust with your client, but we certainly can challenge. Now, in the close of the session, one of the things we could be doing to challenge our clients is to have the conversation around commitment, accountability, staying on track. Because we all know that life gets busy, we all know that life happens, and that it's not easy for our clients to stay on track and to deliver the outcomes that they want for themselves. That does not mean that we lose our position and our role as a coach. We don't suddenly become policemen or judge and jury. We stay in a place of totally honoring our clients, but that doesn't mean we can't ask them a few good questions as we wrap up the session to challenge them. How will you keep yourself on track? How will you honor your commitment to yourself? You said that you want to do this, that, and that. How are you going to make sure that you stick to that? So those are all the types of questions and inquiries that would serve you and would count as good, solid evidence. Another point that I've made once or twice, and I'm going to emphasize here because it relates particularly to competencies 7 and 8. That's the ICF competencies. Is we're listening to hear, has the client achieved something in the session that they didn't arrive with? Or are they leaving the session exactly the same way that they started? So we're listening for growth. We're listening for progress. We're listening for learning. And if you can draw that out at the end of the session to celebrate it, you will get some significant evidence to strengthen not only competency 8, but potentially even some of the other competencies. Now, in order to do that, you obviously need to know what you're doing as a coach. You need to have a number of skills. You need to have a lot of practice. But of course, it's entirely possible. And you need to know that that's the kind of recording that is going to put you in a stronger position, especially for PCC and MCC. You know, not every single coaching session we do is going to show all the competencies with equal light. I would suggest that you choose without manipulating, obviously, and with no scripts and no foul play, but you look for a coaching session that can really highlight the evidence that is required. So when you can show a session that is beyond to-do list coaching, that really works with the who as well as the what, that has a strong contract or outcome and delivers, and that the client leaves with more than they arrived, and that is pretty obvious, that's probably going to be the right performance evaluation recording to select. And on that point, celebrating means acknowledging. I've told you before, we're not cheerleaders, we're not great, wonderful, we're staying neutral, we're showing warmth in our voice, but that does not mean we don't celebrate and honor our clients. Personally, I find the close to be the place to do that. To think of something sincere that we've heard, that we've seen our clients reveal, a vulnerability, a powerful insight, something about them that we just respect, appreciate, and to actually say it, to put it on the table and to acknowledge the client for that, to celebrate their win, to celebrate their achievement, and not just lightly with insincerity, but taking our time to do that. We can also ask our clients how they want to celebrate their own progress, their own success. So we acknowledge them and we give them the space to acknowledge themselves. And that is going to count strongly in your favor. If you don't celebrate your client, it will count as contra evidence. So we might as well do it, and we might as well do it well.